If there is one lesson for Americans to take from the Julian Assange saga, it is not simply that our institutions or our government are corrupt. It is not simply that the government will be so wantonly brazen in the violation of someone's rights to cover up their own wrongdoing. It is not simply the fact that the Biden administration is probably trying to play politics here with this move. What is most important is that the Assange saga, from the moment he stepped on British soil and was held up in an embassy, and then the United States government tried for years to extradite him, to the moment he steps on the soil of Australia as a free man, that entire saga demonstrates the utter failure of America's institutions. And until we confront that, until we deal with that, and until we understand what that means for us as people in America in 2024, and what that means for us as American citizens, and what that means for us in terms of what we believe and what our worldview is as American citizens, we will not truly understand how to confront this problem. But before we get into that, my friends, hello, I am Christian Watson. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political commentary from a philosophical lens, I would encourage you to please like this video, comment on this video, share this video, subscribe to this channel. Despite what some people say, I promise you, you will not get the insights that I give you right here anywhere else. That's why I'm doing this, to be of value to you and to hopefully help refine your thinking on some issues of great social import to us as Americans. Even if you disagree with me, I encourage you to engage in the comment section. As always, an enlightening time. Now on to the video. So, Julian Assange accepted a plea deal for allegedly violating the Espionage Act. And the plea deal, amongst many things that made people raise their eyebrows, one of the things that made me raise my eyebrows is that Julian Assange has to delete classified information that is unpublished about the government. So anything that WikiLeaks has been sitting on for the past decade or so, since Assange has been held up and has been stopped by the authorities in some way, shape, or form, must be terminated. But what also happened immediately after the announcement of the plea deal, thousands of emails from the DNC, because we know that WikiLeaks was one of the big sources that broke the DNC story with Clinton and Podesta and all that stuff that went on. Thousands of emails were erased, purged from the WikiLeaks website. Now, many people are saying this all makes sense why they were willing to be lenient with Assange. But what a lot of people are not understanding is how methodical and how much of an indictment this is about the integrity of America's institutions. Before I get into that, let's remind ourselves of a few things about the Assange case. Let's remind ourselves that the CIA, while he was in the embassy in the UK, basically plotted to kill Assange. Let us remind ourselves that for years and years and years, people have called Assange a traitor simply for exposing information that is of great social import to the American people about their government. That detail, by the way, will become very interesting in a moment here, because that's going to tie into our understanding of institutional legitimacy, consent, moral legitimacy of government, so on and so forth. So hold that thought there. Let us remind ourselves that there were people calling for Assange's death for a non-violent crime that allowed Americans to understand better what was happening in the government. Let us remind ourselves that there are people today calling him a traitor and accusing him of getting people killed for leaking information, when we already know from sources that Assange's information got absolutely nobody killed. The only thing that information killed was the egos of those in power who thought they could hide things. So those details out of the way. We have to understand this in its proper light. Many folks believe that Assange's story is just another rung on the ladder of the never-ending saga of corruption of American institutions. But there's something so much deeper going on here. The Assange saga shows us an existential threat to the preservation of our republic. And one of the ways it does that is showing how the institutions of our country are so rapidly against the people having informed consent. The moral legitimacy of government in the New World American conception does not flow from status. It does not flow from force. It does not flow from mere legalism, nor does it flow from the ability of the government to make up rules on the fly and then get the Supreme Court with the Chevron deference to legitimize them. No, It flows from consent, and consent presupposes something about the nature of man. It presupposes a few qualities about the nature of man, most of all, that man is fundamentally a moral agent that must be in charge of governing his own affairs. This basic principle is endemic to the American worldview, and it's endemic to what American political structure has to offer the world in terms of how it works and also in terms of its virtue. But there is a philosophical question we have to ask with this. How in the world can a citizenry use consent, and therefore, how in the world can a man, this is a downstream question, use his moral authority to interact with society or his government if his consent is not informed? The philosopher Isabel Patterson made a more similar point to this in her book, God of the Machine, where she said that the mass veto, which is basically the informed consent of a citizenry operating in the same exact manner, going against power, the mass veto is what keeps governments in check and keeps tyranny at bay. But when the mass veto, i.e. when the mass consent of many Americans can be hijacked by our institutions, what does that mean? That means the mass veto or consent has lost its moral force, and that therefore means that our government is operating on a principle different than consent that has therefore caused it to become illegitimate. And in the Jeffersonian sense, that would be a cause for a significant revision of the government. Assange's saga actually paints that quite well. If the powers of the government do not arrive from just consent, as posed by the axioms of the American founding, then there is very little legitimacy for our current political regime, and that must be called into question. But when you think about the emails of the DNC being purged and eradicated, this goes beyond the legitimacy of our government, and this goes towards the legitimacy and the potential corruption of our political institutions that are not the government, like the DNC. So one of the mechanisms by which we exercise our consent in America, for better or for worse, is a process called voting, a very integral privilege, not a right, a very integral privilege to a classically Republican society. And so voting is said to be your civic duty, which by the way, I have questions about that. That's a different story. Then it's also said to be the way for you to make your voice heard. When you have a political order that's dominated by motifs and mediocre sophisms, this is what you get. You get that kind of low volume thinking that people just accept because their mother accepted or their brother accepted or their someone in status said so. And so voting is said to be one of the ways to exercise consent. But when a major political organization, which is an integral process of the American political system, is also hijacked, and when the government effectively shields that organization from being held accountable for potentially unethical behavior from those at the upper echelons of its quarters, now the mechanism to exercise consent of the governed has also become compromised. So how in the world are people expected to have any faith, not in our political process, but in the entire political order of America, if not only consent is no longer the basis for which our political institutions operate, but the mechanisms to get consent to our institutions are fundamentally compromised. So this is not just a matter of confidence. This is a matter of butchering first principles. And this is a matter of effectively robbing the average citizen of an effective political mechanism by which to solve issues in a society, therefore entrapping the average American to a fate of artificial hopelessness, which leads to most people to shrug their shoulders whenever an instance of corruption arises in politics. Oh, we know the government is corrupt. Oh, we know this is happening because people have been conditioned by the deprivation of some very core principles in their society to accept injustice, to accept tyranny as if it is the way of life that we should expect. This is no way to create a sound political order. This is no way to have a classically Republican system. This is a way to have despotism through induced passivity and the rejection of moral thinking. Let me say that again. Despotism through induced passivity and rejection of moral thinking. Not anarcho-tyranny. That's different, man. People like to say anarcho-tyranny. No. That is not even 1/10 of the problem we have right now. The problem is they want you to have this sort of induced passivity that keeps you in slumber, even when things that are seemingly minor arise. So the bigger problem here is about our institutions. Now, Ben Ferguson, who is a commentator, went on Piers Morgan's show. And Ben Ferguson was rabid like a wild dog with rabies, as was his co-panelist, who was from the UK. I forgot what her name was. And they were both basically saying that Assange shouldn't have leaked information because people died. The Taliban killed people. He was using a consequentialist argument, which, by the way, was based on lies, to further the notion that Assange was a villain. But what was interesting about his consequentialist argument wasn't that he made it against Assange. It was that it presupposed institutionalism. And that is the issue I wish to talk about now. And so before I get to that, here's some of the argument he made.
You are not a journalist if you are against the Pentagon Papers principle. You're a journalist if you're in favor of free speech.
To incompetency when I'm a journalist, okay? So let me say this. As someone that's been doing radio literally since I was 12 years old, TV since I was 17, I've been given information before to expose things that are wrong in the government, okay? But as a responsible journalist, you also have to look and make sure that you're not doing harm in a mass way to others. Assange is beneath journalism. He is not a journalist. He is a hacker at best who encouraged others to take massive risks and to then be a narcissistic individual who wanted to throw everything out on the internet. If you want to sit next to that guy and say you're the same as him, then you're beneath a journalist, okay? There is a standard of journalism integrity.
Now, institutionalism is something that's actually quite interesting, because many of you have probably heard once or twice from a politician or from somebody that we have to protect our institutions, that we need to have trust in our institutions. And that phrase has always puzzled me. It's puzzled me because I thought institutions were downstream of the agreement of people in society. And I thought institutions were meant to bolster social order, and they were meant to also help man live in society in a manner that allows him to flourish. I thought institutions were meant to be embodiments of virtue that allow man to escape his solitary state and have not just necessarily a more easier life, but a more integrated life that fulfills the principle of sociability within his humanity. I thought institutions were necessary for having the things that produce good societies and also encourage moral behavior. I thought those were institutions was meant for. But now I'm seeing that so many people use institutions or the legitimacy of institutions as a means to justify the unjustifiable. Now I am seeing that the term institutions has been used to induce a kind of blind trust in those who are not just in political power, but who also wield social power. Now I am seeing that institutionalism as itself has been used as a means of preserving the status quo and shielding itself against any moral objection. Institutionalism has blinded so many Americans to the faults of their own institutions. I'm not talking about the government solely. I'm talking about every institution in society that in some way, shape, or form shapes the perceptions of people in society. Many people will say, for example, that schools are an institution, and yet schools as an institution have been drastically changed over the past 270 plus years of American history. Folks will say, for example, that education or beyond education, universities are an institution and they need to be respected. And for so many years, that belief that they need to be respected has induced so many different Americans to have blind trust in the university system and has deprived them of the ability to actually go against some of the ideologies that arose from the belly of those systems that are now being inflicted upon America. A lot of folks, for example, would see these big corporations as institutions. And these bigger corporations are part and parcel to the dissolution of the social order at the behest of activists who have no interest in building a better society. In truth, in their minds they do, but they simply wish to bring forth a utopia through their own actions. Institutions, my friends, have been deified for far too long. And institutions, and our political sense, have been held up on this pedestal that has prevented us from actually being able to see their many flaws. I find institutionalism to be a relic of the sort of Burkean understanding of politics. So Edmund Burke, who was a British philosopher who many people today are more influenced by him than they are our founders, believed that institutions were these sort of vehicles by which the wisdom of the past was contained in and exercised in our society. But Burke also believed, this is very interesting, that society was simply a contract with the dead. That the status quo was very simply the result of the wisdom of accumulated ages passing through, and that we in the present have an obligation to those who came before us. Now, in some sense, Burke was correct, but in another sense, he was incorrect, because his beliefs presupposed that change that is based on abstract principles like justice is actually bad because it harms the integrity of the institutions. In other words, Burke had an institution-first viewpoint, individual second, institutions first, principles second. So many people today have that same kind of worldview, even if they know it or not, and they express it instead through a manner that is just blindingly slavish to certain concepts. When someone says we have to protect national security, what they're talking about normally, if they're invoking that to violate your rights or whatever, what they're talking about normally, they're talking about preserving the integrity of an institution, i.e., the institution of national security, which stands against the ethos of our country. But they have integrated that institution into the ethos, and they have made them one and the same. They have equivocated, they have destroyed distinctions, and now people are convinced that to be a patriot, you need to support your government in spying on people, because someone could be dangerous, so on and so forth. The bluff of American institutions was very simple. It was that our institutions would be a way to ensure that people can have confidence in our government, but not only that, to ensure that the consent of the governed was protected and exercised in the most fruitful way possible. But now we are seeing with what we did to Assange, that not only was that a bluff, but if that was how our institutions were supposed to operate in the first place, they have completely and utterly failed. It's not a matter of hypocrisy. It's a matter of failing to function right. When your institutions frequently engage in black sites where people are disappeared and killed, when it frequently engages in coups and assassinations of foreign leaders against any kind of ethical law, when it frequently engages in subverting people in its own country that are against the narrative but still have the right to free speech, when it frequently engages in so many other kinds of behavior, when it engages in illegal wars and doing war crimes in the name of protecting American hegemony, when your institutions frequently engage in subverting their own members with blackmail, which is what happens in Congress all the time, when your institutions frequently engage in all manner of deviltry and evil, your institutions no longer have legitimacy, number one, but number two, your institutions are no longer a valid argument to be invoked when talking about certain things. Jefferson said that the tree of liberty must be refreshed by blood. Some folks take that in a violent way as a metaphor. Other folks like me believe that what he was saying is that power must be challenged. Our institutions must be challenged. Our society must be challenged, even forcefully, even if it's in a nonviolent way. It must be challenged in order for the principle of liberty, which establishes the just basis for any government, to flourish. But we've become complacent. And many of us as Americans have become complacent. We've become servile. We've become so almost too deferential in the face of our institutions. The biggest lesson that we should take away from Assange is not that he got arrested for telling the truth, is that institutions that were meant to protect your ability to tell the truth failed at their goal. Not only did they fail at their goal, they endorsed a different ethos that sought to manipulate you about what their goal should be, and in the process of doing that, exploit you, violate your rights, tear apart the Constitution, and most certainly divorce themselves from first principles. As Americans, we must turn this around, because if we do not, I'm afraid that our country will be in more peril than it is right now. And trust me, we're in a lot of peril. My friends, like this video, comment on this video, share this video, subscribe to this channel. If you enjoyed my commentary, be sure to donate to me if you want to. Of course, all that information is in the comment section down below. Study history, my friends, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.